Maury. I'm a New York City-based astrologer, and I'd like to welcome you to this evening presentation, podcast number 3, May 12th, 2024. The topic will be forecasting on timing of events. So we're going to do an overview of traditional forecasting methods based on the tradition of Morin de Villefranche from books 22, Directions, his book 23, Revolutions, or what we call today returns, and 24, Progressions and Transits. And as a note, please remember, or you can look for podcast number 2, which was generated on the 5th of May, and that's been posted on Facebook and YouTube. So this tradition is based on Morin de Villefranche and taught by his leading practitioner, Zoltan Mason. Mason said the practice of astrology encourages leading a moral and ethical life and provides to others social and emotional help from a practical viewpoint. So this is part 1, and it will be the study of the natal chart, which is a prerequisite to use any timing technique. And then in part 2, we will discuss the 3 techniques described, primary directions, returns, and transits. But first, there has to be the foundation for the natal chart, or the timing techniques. No successful use of any forecasting method can be employed skillfully without a good feeling for the natal chart. The astrologer must be able to ask 2 questions, or answer 2 questions. The most common misunderstanding about forecasting or timing techniques: they have nothing to do with prediction per se. This should be clear. All prediction, whatever is possible for the human being, must already be seen in the natal chart. All prediction is based on the natal chart. Prediction means, what may I expect during this lifetime? This answer from the natal alone. The question of when to expect the event, that is answered by the various timing techniques. It must be remembered that irrespective of the timing technique used, every method used is based on the natal chart. And Morin wrote and Mason taught, the 4 steps to foretell an event always starts with number 1, the natal, then the primary directions, third would be the returns, and last, the transits. Forecasting's foundation principle is revival of natal influences. Regardless of the forecasting techniques employed, symbolic or reality-based, it is time in one fashion or another that revives or manifests the latent potential which already exists in the natal chart. A forecasting or timing technique is either symbolic or reality-based, but it is time in one fashion or another that revives or makes manifest latent potential which already exists in the natal chart. Morin was not only a great astrologer, but everything was based on the celestial sphere. He was a mathematician, and he very much went against the idea of a symbolic approach. All his techniques, the primaries, the returns, the transits, are based on the actual movements of the sky. On the other hand, we have the so-called symbolic-based traditions. We see that in the progressions, the secondaries, the profections, the solar arc, which is a kind of funny creature, half symbolic and half reality-based, and other techniques. But the symbolic techniques, such as the progressions, secondaries, are very popular because they deal with the psychology of the person. Reality-based traditions, such as the primaries, transits, solars, give an objective view what the human can undergo in the so-called outside world. But that's not necessarily reflected when you look upon the so-called symbolically based traditions. So symbolically based traditions have become very popular with the introduction over the last 50, 60, 70 years of psychology into the tradition of astrology. There's a lot more to it, but we should go on. Today's presentation, forecasting on the timing of the events. Now, a common misunderstanding about forecasting techniques. They have nothing to do with prediction. Again, all prediction is based on the natal. It's the revival of already what exists in the natal. It is time, in one fashion or another, that revives what is in potential in the natal. So, from the viewpoint of astrology studied as a natural science based on observation, some important considerations before the start of our case study. We have to be able to size up the chart. Astrology as a natural science is based on hard facts. So 80% of everything studied is from the natal. You are as you are. The natal shows the limitations. You can absolutely learn, grow, and mature, but you cannot improve continuously. To go completely against what is in the natal is impossible. Nothing good or bad may happen beyond what the natal indicates as a possibility. The natal again shows the limitations. Now, right? Interpretation is an art based on hard facts. So, what are some of the things that we should consider? When we have a chart, we must take the gender, age, background of the individual into account. Judgment is not possible without a knowledge of the natal. Why? How a person reacts to a planet is known from family history. No astrologer knows how you react to a planetary influence. This is known from a family history. So you ask questions, right? A client comes, you ask questions so that you can put the chart into context. Very, very important is that the ascendant, that is the cusp of the first house, corresponds to the 9 o'clock position on a clock face, shows how you control the unconscious, either the emotions or worse, your nature. Your nature is the sign on your ascendant. It's the animal. It's absolutely wrong to be afraid of the bad nature of the malefics and too hopeful of the benefics for good nature. So do not hope or fear too much from aspects without exactness. Exactness of aspects is what gives an aspect its punch. Power of aspects is seen through the sharpness of the aspect. Now, when we look at these different timing techniques, they can be divided into 3 classes. Those which are very important for a life, death, marriage, high dignities, etc. To that we can use the primaries. Those important for the year, solar and lunar returns, arrays, vocation, trips. So the idea is that for the events for the year, the returns are important. So if you have a solar, you would like to know what part of the destiny in the natal becomes important for the year. And for that, consider what house in the solar is over the natal 10th. The idea is that the solar return brings the natal into the present. When it comes to the day-to-day events, the transits. And when you look at the transits, Jupiter and Saturn play a very important part in the study of transits. Transits are not for important events. So, the more important an event, the more important to take all three links, meaning directions, returns, and transits, into consideration. So, our case study today is of a young woman named Christina Hammer. So this is the story of an accidental fatality, a tragedy or a Halloween tragedy. She died 2 days before her 14th birthday. An all-star town league softball player, responsible, intelligent, she was out with a group of her friends for trick-or-treating, dressed as a doll for Halloween. About 20 minutes after leaving her house, she dashed ahead of her friends to cross the street, was hit by a car, and killed instantly. The driver was within the legal speed limit and was not cited. All 10 kids had flashlights and bright clothes on at the time of the tragedy. This is from a quoted birth horoscope. Now, as we're dealing with the tragedy, as our interest in question on the accidental death, we have to consider the first house and the eighth house, and we'll put that into context. So our first task, before we can go to these different timing techniques, is to get acquainted with the natal. As we had discussed in the first two podcasts, we go through the natal in a very organized, structured manner. But when you look to a natal chart, nothing good or bad may happen beyond what the natal indicates as a possibility. You must always know two things about a person, minimally. What are they doing professionally, and what are their hobbies? This addresses a lot the topic of motivation and drive, which at the moment we cannot go into too deeply. So we must know how strongly a person is motivated so that we may be expected, or what may be expected for the person as a possibility in the birth chart. Most important is, what can you expect as a drive, as a motivating influence from a planet? We want to know the quantity of the motivation, the urge, right? You go from day to day, and from time to time there is a very strong urge, as if there would be pushing you from behind, or that you are very strongly attracted. Initially, we do not want to know how the person achieves. That has a lot to do with the quality. That has to do with the so-called planetary zodiacal state. What we want to know is quantity, the urge. So, learn to recognize interference. So as you're studying, going through the chart, if something is given for motivation, what could take it away? Saturn takes away lust, to be motivated. But Saturn can be a negative motivation to do something, right? I am so apprehensive that basically I'm going to do something or have something to be able to get out from under this feeling of negativity. And Mars can be too much, can bring accidents and violence. And motivation can be seen from fire, ambition and a drive for power. Air drives for communication. Water drives for emotions. Earth for security. If we look at the sun and the moon in terms of motivation and drives, it's highly important that we distinguish between a planet's nature. And when we are looking to a chart, there's a tremendous regard for cardinal signs and planets that would be posited in angular houses. Also, the idea is exactness of aspects brings strength. Now, is there a harmonious or disharmonious aspect between the rulers of 1 and 8? That is a very general statement. All disharmonious aspects point to a violent solution, either Martian in nature through the square, the pushing, or Saturnine through the opposition. Now, if we look at this chart, the young woman had a cardinal sign on the ascendant, and the ruler of the cardinal sign, which happens to be one of the lights, is the moon posited in the 10th house in a cardinal sign. So this woman must be like a bullet shot out of a rifle, therefore so strongly oriented towards a given activity once a decision has been made to go towards the activity. We see Saturn here. Saturn could moderate. Now, while this moon is extraordinarily powerful as the ascendant ruler, Saturn is just a little bit more exactly by sextile aspect connected to the ascendant. But the moon in Aries, posited in a cardinal house, is much more powerfully placed than Saturn, beautifully placed in the third, but in a mutable sign. So she must have been an excellent student. Then this Saturn, well placed in Virgo in the third, sextiles the ascendant, but it cannot compete for strength relative to the ascendant ruler of the moon in the 10th in Aries. Now, whatever timing technique you choose to make use of, be it directions, returns, transits, secondaries, solar arc, perfections, and so on, the idea is that it is time that revives or manifests the potential in a natal chart. The natal chart is a static image, a snapshot of the person born at a given place and time. So what is it that is going to animate the natal chart? You can say, oh, the transits, the returns, the directions, and the other techniques mentioned. But the idea is what will blossom from day one. You may say, when you study natal chart, we know we had to analyze very carefully the ascendant and everything connected to the ascendant. But somehow, if there are other considerations that are not connected with the natal ascendant, we want to know, will there be a point in time in which they will manifest? Yes, and it is the timing techniques will tell you when. So you may say, look, I see Mars. Mars is beautifully placed in Leo in the second house, but it's not connected by aspect to the ascendant. We see that, let's take it, Mercury in the fifth house. It's not directly connected to the ascendant, but at some point in time, will that Mercury be able to be manifest, become important for the year? You set up the solar, and you find out that in the solar, the Mercury is very powerfully placed in that solar chart. So that would be the idea. But you have in the beginning a static image and responds most closely in the beginning to the transits. But whether you talk about transits, returns, directions, the whole idea, it is time that revives the potential that's seen in the natal. So now we're going to look at the importance of the dispositor. That is the planet that rules the sign in which a given planet is posited. So in this woman's chart, the moon is in Aries, and Aries is ruled by the planet Mars. So you would say that the moon is disposed of or disposited by Mars. Mason would say, never consider a planet in honor or high honor without automatically looking at the dispositor. So we see here, yes, the ascendant ruler of the ascendant is the moon, posited in the 10th. The dispositor is Mars. So consider first a planet's nature and state, then put a planet in context. So from where does a planet come? Oh, this moon comes from the ascendant. And over what house does it rule? It not only rules the first, but also by exaltation, the 11th. So we said it is posited in the 10th. Where does it go? Oh, the dispositor would be Mars in the 2nd. You may also ask, a planet starts an action, the dispositor takes over, and the final dispositor finishes the action. Okay. So what do we see here? Indeed, Mars is the final dispositor. But is this Mars satisfactory or potentially very dangerous? And we see that this Mars is receiving a razor sharp square from Uranus. Now, this Uranus has a 2-time impact, or maybe is it more, on Mars. First, it aspects the Mars. Second, this Uranus is disposed of by Mars. And thirdly, the nature of the aspect is analogous to the planet Mars. So this Uranus has a 3-fold impact on this Mars. You are putting two very dangerous planets together. Mars can be considered connected with acceleration, and Uranus also can be connected with the idea of speed. So in a square aspect, therefore this aspect is the foundation for an accident, something suddenly unanticipated happening. This Uranus is very important because if we go back to the natal ascendant, we see Cancer, a nice cardinal sign, the ruler in the 10th house in Aries, also a sign connected with acceleration, leadership, and so on. And the final dispositor is Mars. And again, in a beautiful trine aspect, albeit departing. But your eye should immediately see that this Mars is not satisfactory. Although it's in high honor, a planet can be a destroyer not only through a poor zodiacal state, but also if there is too much. Here, this Mars is too much, and the Saturn is not strong enough, be it through house position, be it through sign position, be it through a sextile aspect to the ascendant, relative to the strength of this Mars. So you become very concerned, could such a person who is very highly motivated head for an accident that could be fatal? So where is the ruler of the ascendant and its dispositor by house position, sign position? We mentioned that. And he said that if the moon rules the ascendant, it means that the moon and its dispositor, Mars, are connected with the house of life. The house of life, okay? If we're interested in the topic of death, we analyze the eighth house the same way we analyze the first. And here we find that the eighth house is connected with Uranus and Saturn. And the dispositors of Saturn and Uranus are Mercury and Mars, respectively. So we ask questions. Is the ruler of the ascendant connected to the ascendant? Yeah, the moon, beautifully connected from the 10th. Whether the aspect be harmonious or disharmonious, it would mean that somehow the strong influence of the moon will be seen on the ascendant. So we must also consider how much quantity and quality these planets influence. This will allow us to know how strong are the person's physical and mental condition. Although Cancer per se is not a very strong sign physically, you see that the ruler is the moon posited in Aries, the first sign of spring, ruled by Mars and also by the sun by exaltation. Then we would look to the dispositor of the moon, and the dispositor is Mars, posited in Leo, a planet connected with the sun. So this adds a lot of strength. So now, ask an important question. Is there a connection between the first and the eighth? Well, initially, I see the first is the moon, the eighth is Uranus and Saturn, and neither Uranus nor Saturn are connected to the moon, the ascendant ruler. But when we went on to look to the dispositor of the moon, we did indeed find that Uranus is 3 times connected to the Mars in the 5th, which has a lot to do with sports, and is the modern co-ruler of Aquarius on the 8th. So somehow the death could be connected with the 5th house. And remember, we said that she went out ahead of her girlfriends on trick-or-treating on Halloween night. If we look to the 11th house, that would be the friends, and we do find that the ruler of the 11th is Venus in the 5th house. If we would do a simple derivation, the 10th house of the 11th, that is the realization of the friends occupation of the friends, is in the 8th house, meaning their 10th house, her 8th house. So the ruler of their 8th house, of their 10th house, by derivation, her 8th house is the 10th house of the friends. And we do find that the modern co-ruler of Aquarius is in the 5th. So we may say, look, her destiny somehow is going to be connected, or the friends and their destiny are connected with her 5th house. Uranus as co-ruler of their 10th house, and Venus as ruler of their 1st house. The, if you want, 8th and 11th houses here. So somehow her tragedy is connected with her friends. And remember, we said, this Uranus to Mars, the acceleration and the inclination through the speeding up could be fatal. This is a question of too much, too little. If we would go back and just say, look, how can this Mars be so bad? It's in honor, high honor of triplicity. Yes, but a planet can be destructive not only through its zodiacal state, but also quantity wise. Too much or too little will destroy. So here we went through an analysis, and we find out that if you look at this Mars, does the ruler of the, let's take it, or dispositor of the ruler of the ascendant, or the ruler of the 10th house in the natal, dispose of other planets? Yes, it disposes of the Sun, Uranus, and Venus. A planet becomes that much more powerful the greater the number of planets over which it would dispose. This Mars is extraordinary in many a way. So now, having just a basic or having some feeling for the natal, we're now going to take into account the timing techniques. As we said, before we can use any of the timing techniques, we have to have a feeling for the natal chart itself. So the traditional forecasting methods used based on the tradition of Morin, the primary directions, that's book 22, his revolutions, what we today call returns, based on book 23, and his progressions and transit based on book 24. Now, when I have taught these three timing techniques, I usually would start out with transits because they're the easiest, and then I would go on to the returns, and then finally the directions. But it's interesting to note, and Morin makes this clear, that the crown jewel of his whole tradition is book 21, which is determining the nature of the natal chart. What may I expect during this lifetime? But then he brings the timing techniques into account next in books 22, 3, and 4. So for the podcast this evening, I'm going to follow his sequence. We studied a little about the natal chart. We're now going to look at the revolutions and then finally the transits. But again, I don't start out with directions when I first start a new program teaching, because already directions are a complex topic. But for the sake of this podcast, again, I'm going to follow Morin's approach. We'll talk about directions first, then returns, and then transits. So, in the preface of book 22, Morin writes of directions. This is the principal and most divine book of all astrology. The one by means of which the times of the events that happen to a man after his birth are discovered, which is the supreme apex of natural philosophy and the science that before all other physical sciences partakes of divinity. So we had book 21. Okay, how do you analyze, how do you put the natal chart together? But then book 22 follows with the first and what Morin considers to be the most important timing technique, the so-called primary directions. And we just looked at the preface to that book. So, a question. What stands still and grows outward? A tree. The houses are the earth, and all grow outwards at a uniform rate. So we're going to consider just the cusp of the first and the 10th and bring in the 8th. Now, it's with the 7 aspects, or if we want, if it's with the 7 rays cast by a planet, that you can start to appreciate how primary directions operate by means of the primary motion of the celestial sphere. Okay, so it appears because of our positive position here on Earth that the sun rises, culminates at noon, declines at sunset, and goes towards the 10th house or the 4th house in the evening, and then at midnight, after midnight, it comes back again to the first. So let's see if we can appreciate how important are the aspects now. We've talked a lot about aspects, discussed a lot in terms of natal interpretation, but it's with the primary directions that you really appreciate aspects. So, how many rays? You see that the Neptune sends an opposition. The moon is, Neptune is at 18 Sagittarius. That means that the opposition terminates at 18 Gemini. So that point on the celestial sphere at 18 Gemini will be determined towards the nature of Neptune for the person's entire life. The sextile occurs at 18 Libra. Again, it means that point at 18 Libra will be determined towards the nature of Neptune for the entire life of the person. Then, likewise, for the sextile at 18 Aquarius, then the square at 18 Virgo, then the square at 18 Pisces. It means wherever those rays terminate, the impact of the planet casting the ray, in this case Neptune, will determine the nature of that point on the ecliptic for the entire life of the person. When does that become very significant? You'll notice in all the cases here, the opposition point, the 2 sextiles, the 2 trines, the 2 squares. At none of those points do we find any object. We don't find any planet. Does it mean that those points are not important? She had 2 very important Neptunian directions. In one case, a few days, a couple of weeks after, let's take it, or before her birthday, connected with the midheaven, and then in February, which she had already passed, connected by trine to the midheaven. So at none of these points do we find any object. So those points where the rays terminate are in potential. So you want to know, when will they come alive? So we say, look, at 18 Libra or 18 Aquarius, there's a sextile, but there's no there's no receiver. It's just sending out the influence, and it terminates and is there lifelong, but there's no object, no planet. And similar, the ray, which is at square at 18 Pisces, no object. It's latent. When will it come alive? Let's see. Primary motion. How do we show that? You see the arrows on the outside, how the Earth, right, by motion is coming into contact with the planets. Oh, let's see. So we have a point at 18 Pisces that's determined towards the nature of Neptune. Likewise, the trine at 18 Aries. Okay, that actually should be a little further to the right, not to the left of the moon. My mistake. But in both instances, the first one on November 20th of 93 comes into contact with who's the receiver? The midheaven. So it has to do with our actions and undertakings. Let's see what that can mean. So what happens is, I asked, what stands still and yet grows outward? So when she was born, the midheaven was 3 Aries 53. Now, throughout history, people who have used primary directions wanted to convert the idea of space into time. In other words, how much space, how much will that point at 3 Aries 53 grow in the course of, say, a year? So you're going to say, when she was born, the midheaven was 3 Aries 53. Year 2, the midheaven was 4 Aries 53. At year 10, if we let it grow, the midheaven will be 13 Aries 53, and so on. So the Earth grows. It stands still, but it grows. And what happens when eventually the tree grows, and at that point in time, the midheaven will be 18 Pisces 48. Is there an object there? Yes, the object there is the ray that terminates at 18 Pisces 53. Right? That point at 18 Pisces 53 is latent. It's in potential. There's no receiver, right? It's just sending out something. But the minute it comes into physical contact with that point at 18 Pisces 50 or 48, an event will occur. Okay? So by motion, by primary motion, we bring into contact a significator or subject. All houses are subject. Houses are only receivers. It's the planets and signs that send, but the houses per se as receivers. And the most important points, a most important point in a house is the cusp of the house, and that is called a significator or the subject. and it comes into contact with a so-called promoter. A promoter can be a planet or an aspect. What will happen? It will precipitate an event according to the terrestrial determinations. Okay, let's see if we can go a little further. In a similar way, we see that the trine occurs a little after her death, February 1st at 94, again to the mid-heaven. So that point at 18 Aries 48 is determined towards the nature of Neptune for the entire life. But it's latent. It's the potential. When will it come alive? Again, right? When the midheaven now goes forward, this is called direct. Going in the previous direction, which we had seen, is called converse. Here, the midheaven is growing at a uniform rate, and as soon as the midheaven grows to 18 Aries 48, it's going to come into contact with this, let's take it, prometer, or this point. An event is going to occur. And what is the event? That point at 18 Aries 48 is in a sign of Aries. So you have to look automatically to Mars. Have we looked at the Mars previously? Yes, we know that the Mars is ruling not only the midheaven, dispositive of the moon, and in a trine to Mars. So something Martian is going to come about, right? We do not forget that in the natal, Mars as ruler of the midheaven is trine Mars, albeit departing. It still means that it's very strong. So what do I want to keep in mind? In the natal, we go back, remember, it's the foundation of everything, that this Mars rules the midheaven, dispositor of moon, ruler of the ascendant, and the dispositor of the moon is Mars, which already is in a relationship with Neptune as a trine. Okay. So we have set the stage following a Morin's approach. We studied the natal first. Then he said, okay, now let's put this into context. Does the person have any directions in play? We already know that she is very accelerated. The ruler is in the 10th house, posited in Aries, a Martian sign under a very powerful Mars that is impacted 3 times, receiving impact from Uranus 3 times. So there's tremendous acceleration, right? As the mini bio indicated, she was walking with her friends, all dressed up to go for the Halloween trick-or-treating, and all of a sudden, impulsively, she leapt forward, ran across the street, and at that point was struck and killed by a motorist. But did this happen every time she would do this? Run across the street? No, we have to remember that when this happened, she was under the influence of Neptune. Neptune takes away clarity. Neptune can take away concentration. Neptune can bring daydreaming. So from a person who is very accelerated from birth, who normally seemingly has not been harmed because of her natural inclination to accelerate and speed up, now she's under the cloud of Neptune. So next, after book 22, comes the returns. So here is her return. I should have shown you first the return. On the lower left is the natal. The upper right is the return for the year. And we would go through the return in a very orderly fashion, the way that we went through the natal, and we would see what things were very powerful. So, what is a return? Astronomically, it's the return, in this case, if it's a solar, the sun, to the same degree, minute, and second of the sign it's posited in. So in the natal, the sun is at 10 Scorpio 7 minutes, and in the return, at the moment of return, the sun is again at 10 Scorpio 7, sitting on the descendant. And then we would go through the chart in such a way as to see if the most important principle when it comes to return comes out. The most important principle when you do a return, be it solar or lunar, is repetition. Does the return somehow revive what already is in the natal chart? And we're going to be asking question as, we know the Mars is very, well, we would see that both the natal ascendant and the solar ascendant are in water, in trine, which is good. But then we would start to see that we knew Mars is very powerful in natal. Is it once again powerful in the solar? And so we would make a list and consider all those things that repeat what already exists in the natal become very important, standing over and above anything else that you would notice in the solar. So we would see, look, in the natal, I see that 3 planets are in Scorpio at the disposal of Mars and Leo. If I look at the solar, I see that she has 4 planets in Scorpio, of which the dispositor, Mars, itself is in Scorpio. Now, remember that the natal chart is a static image, a snapshot. As a timing method, what does the return do? It brings the natal chart into the present. The natal is the birth chart at a given point in place in time. But as you grow, more and more your life becomes organized, and at a given point in time, events occur. In this case, when you use the solar, it brings the natal into the present. Now, let's see. I have something that is out of sequence here. Bear with me for a moment. I apologize. I should have moved one slide. Let's take it. down. I showed you earlier transit. Okay, we looked at the solar, and now we're going to look at the natal. Now, Morin and Mason did also teach the most important transits for the year occur on the day of your return. If you go to book 24 of Morin on transits and progressions, Morin points out sometimes astrologers have been confused because when a dramatic event happens, they don't find a corresponding event in the sky that would confirm that event. So let's take it, somebody dies on a given day through having a stroke or a heart attack. The astrologer looks in the sky and does not find a corresponding configuration that could or explain the death. Morin says, wait, don't look always on the day of the event. Fall back to the return, and you're going to find that there will be a corresponding configuration that will explain the event that occurs on a given day. The point is, the most important transits occur on the day of your solar return or on the day of your lunar. Notice here that on the day of her solar return, you find Neptune at 18 Capricorn 40 conjunct within 2 minutes, 6 minutes, not 6 degrees, 6 minutes of arc. That's as sharp as can be. So you want to know, is Uranus or Neptune powerful? You fall back to the natal and you say, oh, I know that Uranus is very important because I've studied it, and I noticed that it is influencing the Mars 3 times, influencing Mars 3 times. Neptune, is that significant? Yeah, Neptune is very significant. How? So you look around, you say, oh, it's entering the 6th. Is it connected to other planets? Oh, yes, in a razor sharp sextile aspect to the Pluto. But remember, we studied the natal, then we did the primaries, and we indicated that there's a very important primary direction in force. So we studied the natal, then the primaries, which gave us the idea that Neptune is in force, and then we look at the solar, and we see this conjunction, which is very sharp, and it's exactly opposing the natal ascendant, and it is exactly sextiling the here in the summer, solar moon, solar Mercury. Okay, let's go forward. Now, there is a big difference between the returns and the transits. Astrologically, a return is an extension of transits. That adds the complexity of needing to take into account both the natal and the return houses. And what the return does is bring the static image of the natal into the present. So this is the solar return for 1993. And we looked at this conjunction of Uranus-Neptune. When you study a return, it's a three-step process. First, you look at the natal, you put it aside, then you look at the solar, apply the same rules, and then you put the two together and look for revival of influences. So, what do we notice here? The natal Mars is conjunct, very exact, to the solar midheaven. Okay, we know how important this Mars is. From where does this natal Mars come that conjuncts the solar? This should say solar midheaven. Excuse me, my mistake. So where does it come from in the natal? It comes from being the ruler of the midheaven, dispositor of the moon, and now found conjunct solar midheaven. Why is it important? Because in the natal, Mars already rules the natal midheaven. Therefore, this comes back to the idea is the most important consideration in any solar chart will be the repetition. Here we see this tremendous repetition. Again, you have to appreciate how important is this Mars. Then we would see other considerations. We would notice that the solar Mars is in a razor sharp square to the natal Mars. So we have this idea of Mars, Mars, Mars being very strong. Mars in Leo, I said, is in high honor. And in the solar, Mars is in Scorpio, again in domicile. So you're going to say, how can a planet which is in such high honor destroy? Destruction is not only by necessarily zodiacal state, it can also be by sheer quantity, exaggeration. Too much can destroy. You have here acceleration, and you have forcefulness, and that is a formula for accidents. And she is as if inebriated. Remember, through a primary direction, he saw that she was under a Neptunian direction that fell only 10 days or 12 days before her solar return. As Mason and as Morin taught, when do you use the techniques for the very important events? And that's what I try to bring out in this podcast, that not only do you take into account the natal as the foundation of forecasting, but then in order of priority, primaries, returns, and transits. All three. And somehow does one confirm the other. But again, the idea is all forecasting depends on time. It's time that revives or manifests potential in the natal chart. Here we have the lunar returns. And again, you go from the general to the particular. The general would be the natal chart. Then you go and you somehow delimit the scope of influence through the solar. The solar is for a 12-month period, but you can break up the 12 months into about 13 returns, and you can bring it down closer and closer to the day. So first, you have the understanding of the natal. Second, you ask the primary directions, if any, in force. Third, the solar. And lastly, the transits. The transits. And what you have is a link of 4 chains. The link of 4 chains, the natal, the primaries, the returns, and the transits. So here we have on the lower left the natal, and here on the upper right the lunar. And what do we notice immediately? The lunar return is in the same element as the element on the ascendant, water. In the natal, Cancer; for the lunar return, Scorpio. Now, as I mentioned, note that she has the same solar or same lunar ascendant as her solar ascendant in 2 days. Again, time revives. Let's look at this natal, this lunar. So Morin divided transits into 2. You have the simple transit, a planet just transiting through the cusp, through a house. So, for example, if you have a sign rising and on the day of the return you find Venus is sitting on your natal ascendant, you may expect for the month something that would be more or less pleasant. Here we have Saturn by simple transit going across or through the solar 8th house. And what we notice is what? That this Saturn in transit in the 8th is in an opposition to Mars. Okay? Very dangerous. Then you have in transit, by transit for the month, the transiting or lunar Mars in a razor sharp square to natal Mars. We've already discussed, but I should have indicated here, I should have said, look, there is by an arrow, the transiting Mars in the lunar is exactly opposite the natal Mars. So in effect, opposition transiting to the Mars and solar and lunar Mars squaring natal Mars. In effect, you have a T square. Saturn opposite means slow down, postpone, don't do anything. On the other hand, the square from the transiting lunar Mars means speed up, go ahead. This is a very dreadful T-square. You want to go ahead, but you want to stop. This person who is normally very, very speedy. Remember, you go back to the natal. The natal has a cardinal sign rising. The ruler itself is one of the lights in the 10th house, an angular house, posited in a cardinal sign, Aries, and the dispositor is Mars. So this person was a leader. She moved very fast. This combination of Moon as ruler of the 10th in Aries, she moves like a bullet out of the barrel of a gun. And she had been lucky up to a point. But what happened with the primary is as if she would be put into a kind of fog. And then the solar and lunars showed the influence of both Saturn and Mars on her natal Mars, which is so very important. Then when we looked at it in the beginning, we found that this Uranus is connected 3 times to natal Mars. And this is an aspect connected with, accidents. So we've come to the end of our podcast. I mentioned to date there are 5 different immediate sources for Morin's book 21. The most recent, which has just come out now, is a very beautifully done, very carefully done, filled with copious footnotes. A second look at book 21, translated from the Latin by a woman who has been an attorney, retired, and now a very fine translator of Latin. And these sources, and especially Penny Cedar's translation, I do think will become a foundation text for the study of Morin. So I mentioned that I'll be starting a new class in about a month, a new quarter, and each quarter is composed of 12 lessons. Each lesson is 90 minutes long with slides sent beforehand and a video of the session sent afterwards. I anticipate that the classes are going to be held on a Sunday night from 7 until 8:30 Eastern Daylight Time. The cost of each quarter actually is 500, but it perhaps will go up to 600. I don't know. I have to see. Tomorrow I will put up podcast 3, and it will be available on YouTube and Facebook. Just this morning, I have been reading, and I came across an old proverb. I had heard it many years ago, but forgotten, but it revived my memory. I hear, I forget. I see, I remember. I do, I understand. And for me, what a beautiful proverb for a practitioner of astrology, studied as a natural science and as an art, observation and imagination. I hear, I forget. I see, I remember. I do, I understand. All of what I've discussed, all of the astrology as I've discussed, all of this is valueless per se if you don't apply it. A teacher doesn't teach you. A teacher provides you trustworthy information, but it's up to you to go out and corroborate what the teacher says. Okay? That's the doing. It's like going into a residency after medical school. Before you went to medical school, you didn't know what you didn't know. You go to medical school, you finally found out what you didn't know. But to assimilate it, to become a part of you, you have to go out and do. So, with that, thank you for your attention and have a good evening. Good night.